London, a grey April afternoon in 1970. The offices of Apple Corp are unusually quiet. Legal papers cover the mahogany tables. Outside, hundreds of fans weep inconsolably after hearing the news that shook the world. The Beatles are no more. The band that defined an entire decade, that sold more records than any artist in history, that filled stadiums and provoked mass hysteria on 5 continents, has broken up. For young men, who barely a decade ago had nothing but cheap guitars and impossible dreams, have decided to go their separate ways. But how did they get here? What transformed 4 teenagers from a war-torn port city into the architects of a cultural revolution? The answer begins 20 years earlier, in the bombed-out streets of Liverpool. Liverpool, 1940. The Second World War has left deep scars on this port city in northwest England. German bombing raids destroyed thousands of buildings. Families live in cramped terraced houses, sharing outdoor toilets and battling the bone-chilling, damp cold. In this landscape of reconstruction, on October 9th of that year, John Winston Lennon is born in the Oxford Street Maternity Hospital as air raid sirens wail in the distance. His mother, Julia, is a free-spirited woman with an infectious laugh. His father, Alfred, is a merchant seaman who is rarely home. 7 years later, on June 18, 1942, James Paul McCartney was born at Walton Hospital. His mother, Mary, was a nurse and midwife. His father, Jim, played piano in local bands during his younger years. Music already flowed through the veins of this working-class family. The 1950s slowly transformed Liverpool. The port regained its activity. Sailors brought records from the United States, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, sounds that British radio barely played. In the Mendip's house, where John lived with his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George after his parents' separation, the boy grew up rebellious and creative. He drew cartoons, wrote absurd stories, and questioned all authority. His Aunt Mimi, a strict woman with Victorian manners, tried unsuccessfully to discipline him. Paul grows up on Forth Lynn Road, in a house where music is as common as afternoon tea. His mother plays the piano. His father collects sheet music. The boy learns melodies by ear, absorbing the structure of popular songs. He is a diligent, polite student, the kind of boy adults call a good lad. But something burns beneath that polite surface, a fierce ambition and a musical talent that astonishes those who hear him sing. July 6, 1957. The St. Peter's Church Parish Fair in Woolton vibrates with music and voices. On a makeshift stage, a group of teenagers plays skiffle, that hybrid genre of jazz, blues, and folk that's sweeping through British youth. The lead singer is 16, wears a plaid shirt, and plays his guitar with more attitude than precision. His name is John Lennon, and his band is the Quarrymen. Among the audience, a 15-year-old boy watches intently. Paul McCartney has come with a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan. After the concert, Ivan introduces them. Paul borrows a guitar and, with astonishing ease, plays Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, a complex song that few teenagers master. He sings every word correctly, a rare feat in an age without the internet or printed lyrics. John watches, impressed but envious. This boy is a better musician than he is. Inviting him into his band means sharing the spotlight, perhaps even losing it. But rejecting him would be wasting obvious talent. Days later, John makes the decision that will change the history of music. He invites Paul to join the Quarrymen. Liverpool, 1958. Paul has been playing with the Quarrymen for months. The friendship between John and Paul deepens rapidly. They discover that they both lost their mothers. Julia Lennon was killed by an off-duty police officer in July of that year, leaving John devastated. Mary McCartney had died of cancer when Paul was 14. This shared grief binds them together in ways that transcend music. One day, Paul tells John about a classmate from Liverpool Institute, their secondary school. The boy's name is George Harrison. He's only 15, but he plays the guitar with astonishing skill. He's shy, quiet, with a quiet determination that impresses. Paul invites him to a rehearsal. George arrives with his guitar and plays Raunchy, an instrumental piece, flawlessly. John hesitates again. George is too young, he thinks. He looks like a child, but his talent is undeniable. Finally, he agrees. The Quarrymen are now a trio. Liverpool, 1960. The Quarrymen have evolved. They've played in small clubs, at parties, anywhere that will have them. They've experimented with different names, Johnny and the Moondogs, the Silver Beatles. They're looking for something that sounds both rebellious and memorable. John, obsessed with puns, suggests Beatles, a play on beat and beetle. It's strange, different, exactly what they need. They're missing something crucial, a consistent drummer. They've gone through several, none quite right. Then they meet Pete Best, son of Mona Best, owner of the Casbah Coffee Club where they've played. Pete is handsome, has stage presence, and plays decently. They invite him to join just before a crucial trip. They've been offered a residency in Hamburg, Germany. Nightclubs in the German port city are looking for British bands willing to play for endless hours. It's a risky but necessary opportunity. With Pete on drums, the Beatles board a ferry to an uncertain future. Hamburg, August 1960. The Indra Club is a seedy dive in the St. Pauli red light district. Prostitutes, sailors, criminals, and bohemians fill the place every night. The Beatles are scheduled to play 4.5 hours a night, 6 nights a week, sometimes 8 hours. The owner, Bruno Koschmider, yells at them to make more noise, more of a show. Make a show, he demands in his German accent. There's no rest. They sleep in tiny rooms behind the screen of a movie theater, the Bambikino, without heating or proper showers. The conditions are brutal, but something extraordinary happens. Forced to fill so much time, they begin to improvise, extend songs, and experiment. John drinks beer and shouts obscenities into the microphone. Paul perfects his voice, imitating Little Richard with increasing precision. George develops complex guitar solos. Pete maintains powerful rhythms that shake the ground. They take Preludin, stimulant pills, to stay awake all night. The music becomes rawer, more visceral, more authentic. In that inferno of smoke and sweat, the Beatles cease to be teenagers playing at parties and become professional musicians forged in fire. Hamburg also brings them something else, a friend who will change their lives. Stuart Sutcliffe is a student at the Liverpool College of Art, a classmate of John's. He's a talented painter, considered the best of his generation at the school. He doesn't play the bass particularly well, but John insists he join the band. Stuart buys a bass with the money from selling a painting and travels with them to Hamburg. In Germany, Stuart met Astrid Kircher, a 20-something photographer with an avant-garde style and an exceptional artistic eye. Astrid was captivated by the band, especially Stuart. They began an intense romance. She photographed the Beatles with artistic compositions that captured their youthful rebellion. She suggested they change their rockabilly hairstyles, with their slicked-back pompadours, for a cleaner, more avant-garde cut that fell over their foreheads. First Stuart adopted the style, then George, and finally everyone except Pete. It was the birth of the mop top, the hairstyle that would define their global image. Liverpool, December 1960. The Beatles returned from Hamburg completely transformed. They are no longer the insecure lads who played in basements. Now they are a well-oiled musical machine, with stage presence, an extensive repertoire, and boundless confidence. They begin playing at the Cavern Club, a vaulted basement on Matthew Street that smells of damp and spilled beer. The Cavern was originally a jazz club, but now it welcomes rock and roll during lunchtime sessions. Office workers, students, and secretaries descend the stairs during their lunch break to listen to live music. The Beatles play there regularly, sometimes several times a week. Sweat drips from the brick walls. The acoustics are terrible. The equipment is rudimentary. But something magical happens in that basement. A community of devoted fans begins to form. Young girls scream their names. Local fame grows exponentially. And among the crowd, one day in November 1961, a man in a perfectly tailored suit and with impeccable manners observes the spectacle with professional interest. His name is Brian Epstein, and nothing will ever be the same again. Liverpool, October 28, 1961. Brian Epstein walks through the city center with his characteristic elegant stride. At 27, he runs NEMS, the family record shop in Whitechapel. He is successful, meticulous, and obsessed with perfect customer service. He comes from a wealthy Jewish family in Liverpool. His life is comfortable but empty. Something is missing: purpose, passion, an outlet for his frustrated creativity. That day, several teenagers came into the shop asking for a record called My Bonnie by a group called the Beatles. Brian had never heard of them. He was annoyed that they didn't have the record in stock. He investigated. He discovered that the band was local, that they played regularly at the Cavern Club, just minutes from his shop. Curiosity consumed him. On November 9th, during his lunch break, he went downstairs at the Cavern to see them play. The Cavern is packed. Cigarette smoke hangs in the humid air. The smell of beer and sweat is overwhelming. Brian, in his Seville rose suit, stands out like a penguin in a jungle. On the small stage, four young men play with an energy that electrifies the place. They eat, drink, joke between songs, and smoke on stage. Their manners are atrocious by Brian's standards. But there's something more: raw talent, undeniable charisma, a chemistry between them that's palpable even in that grimy basement. Brian is captivated. He returns multiple times. He observes the screaming girls, the audience's reaction. He sees beyond the chaos and lack of professionalism. He sees unlimited commercial potential. He sees stars waiting to be polished. In December, he approaches them after a show. He invites them to his office. He proposes something radical: to become their manager, despite having no experience whatsoever in the music industry. The Beatles are hesitant. Brian is a businessman in a suit who sells records. What does he know about rock and roll? But his enthusiasm is infectious, his connections are real, and he promises to get them a record deal. They agree. On January 24th, 1962, they sign a management contract. Brian Epstein officially becomes their manager. The transformation begins immediately. Brian demands discipline: no eating, drinking, or smoking on stage. No obscenities into the microphone. No greeting friends during performances. He buys them identical suits designed by a tailor. He insists they bow in unison after every song, a gesture of appreciation to the audience that will become their signature. John hates all of it. He feels domesticated, reduced to a commodity. But even he recognizes that Brian opens doors. The man works tirelessly, using every contact, every favor, every opportunity to promote his band. London, January 1962. Brian travels with a Beatles demo recording under his arm. He visits all the major record labels. Decca Records finally agrees to listen to them. On January 1st, the Beatles travel to London for a formal audition. Nervous and out of their element, they play 15 songs. The performance is solid but not spectacular. Dick Rowe, a Decca executive, rejects them with a phrase that will go down in history: "Guitar groups are going out of fashion, Mr. Epstein." Brian is devastated but doesn't give up. He visits EMI, Britain's largest record label. A young producer named George Martin, who works at the Parlophone label, agrees to listen to them. Martin is a polite, mild-mannered man with a classical background. He mainly produces comedy and jazz. He doesn't know much about rock and roll, but something about the Beatles' music intrigues him. He agrees to a trial session. Abbey Road Studios, London, June 6, 1962. The Beatles enter the legendary studio for the first time. The facilities are intimidating. High ceilings, sophisticated equipment, engineers in white coats operating complex machines. George Martin watches them from the control room. They play several original songs. Martin is impressed, but not entirely convinced. After the session, he asks if there's anything they don't like. George Harrison replies with dry humor: "Well, for starters, we don't like your tie. The ice is broken." Martin laughs. The chemistry begins to form. However, Martin has a concern: Pete Best. The drummer isn't up to the standard of the other three. His timing is inconsistent, his style too simplistic for what Martin envisions in the studio. He shares his doubts with Brian. The decision is painful but unavoidable. Liverpool, August 16, 1962. Brian Epstein summons Pete Best to his office. The words are direct and devastating. "The lads want you to leave the band." Pete is stunned. He's been with them for 2 years, survived Hamburg, played hundreds of shows. But John, Paul, and George have made their decision. None of them have the courage to tell him in person. Brian, the businessman with no musical experience 6 months ago, must carry out the most difficult dismissal of his fledgling career. Pete leaves the office devastated. His fans organize protests outside the Cavern Club. Some hold banners that read, "Pete forever, Ringo never." But the decision is final. In his place comes Richard Starkey, better known as Ringo Starr, drummer for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, another Liverpool band. Ringo is 22 years old, with a prominent nose, sad eyes, and a peculiar sense of humor. He isn't technically the best drummer in town, but his personality fits perfectly with the other three. He's laid back where they are intense, patient where they are impulsive. The quartet is complete. The definitive lineup of the Beatles finally exists. Abbey Road, September 4th, 1962. Ringo records his first session with the Beatles. The song is called Love Me Do, a simple composition by Paul with harmonica by John. The melody is catchy but simple. George Martin isn't entirely sure it will be a hit. In fact, he brings in a session drummer, Andy White, as backup. Ringo plays tambourine on that version, humbled but professional. On October 5th, Love Me Do was released as a single. Brian bought 10,000 copies to inflate initial sales. Local radio stations began playing it. Slowly, the record climbed the charts. It reached number 17 in the UK charts. It wasn't a smash hit, but it was a start. The Beatles had a record out. They were professional recording artists. The dream was taking shape. Abbey Road, November 1962. George Martin is pressuring John and Paul. They need a smash hit for their next single. Paul has a melody in mind, something more complex, more melodic than Love Me Do. The song is called Please Please Me. Originally a slow ballad, Martin suggests speeding it up, making it more urgent. In the studio, they experiment with the arrangement. John sings the lead vocals with almost desperate intensity. Paul's vocal harmonies are perfect. The final result has an energy that Love Me Do lacked. When they finish, George Martin presses the intercom from the control room. His usually measured voice is filled with real excitement. "Gentlemen, you've just recorded your first number one." He's right. Please Please Me is released on January 11th, 1963. By February, it's at number one on most of the British charts. Beatlemania is about to explode. Abbey Road, February 11th, 1963. EMI wants to capitalize on the success of Please Please Me with a full album. The problem? The Beatles have a packed concert schedule. The solution? Record an entire album in a single day. It's a crazy idea, almost impossible. Bands usually spend months in the studio, but the Beatles are used to playing 4-hour shows. For them, a full day of recording is feasible. They start at 10 in the morning. They record 14 songs in 13 hours, most in 1 or 2 takes. The last song of the day is Twist and Shout, an Isley Brothers cover. John has a terrible cold. His throat is wrecked after hours of singing. George Martin knows they only have one shot. John's voice won't survive multiple takes. John drinks a glass of warm milk, stands in front of the microphone, and delivers a vocal performance of brutal intensity, his raspy voice adding a perfect vulnerability to the song. It's a single take. Perfect. Impossible to repeat. The album Please Please Me was released on March 22, 1963. It reached number one and remained there for 30 weeks, until it was replaced by their second album. The Beatles were no longer just a promising band from Liverpool. They were the defining phenomenon. London Palladium, October 13, 1963. Outside the legendary theater, thousands of teenagers block Argyle Street. They shout. They cry. They try to break through the police barricades. Inside, 15 million people across the UK are glued to their black and white televisions. Sunday night at the London Palladium is the most watched variety show in the country. Tonight, the Beatles are the headliners. When they appear on stage, the theater erupts. The screams are so loud they almost drown out the music. Girls faint in their seats. Others weep uncontrollably. The police struggle to maintain order. The next day, British newspapers have a new word in their headlines: Beatlemania. The phenomenon has a name, and it's only just beginning. London, November 4th, 1963. The Prince of Wales Theatre is hosting the Royal Variety Performance, a charity show for the royal family. The Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and Lord Snowdon are in the royal box. The Beatles, 4 working-class lads from Liverpool, are scheduled to perform for the British aristocracy. It's an extraordinary cultural moment, rock and roll before royalty. Before their last song, John approaches the microphone. The audience waits with bated breath. John smiles mischievously. "For our next song, I'd like to ask for your help. People in the cheap seats, clap your hands. The rest of you, just rattle your jewelry." The theater erupts in laughter. Even the Queen Mother smiles. It's a perfect moment of British irreverence. The Beatles show that they can be popular without being obsequious, successful without losing their authenticity. New York, February 7, 1964. The Pan Am flight from London lands at Kennedy Airport. On board are the Beatles, nervous and skeptical. Brian Epstein has meticulously planned this invasion of America, but everyone has their doubts. America is the world's largest market, but also the most difficult to conquer. No British band has ever had real success there. Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, all the Beatles' musical heroes are American. Why would Americans want a British version of their own music? When the plane door opens, they hear something impossible, deafening screams. 3,000 teenagers have invaded the airport. They hold up banners. "We love you, Beatles. Marry me, John." The police can barely contain the crowd. The Beatles get off the plane in disbelief. America, incredibly, already loves them before they've even played a single note on American soil. New York, February 9, 1964. The Ed Sullivan Show is the most important television institution in the United States. Elvis appeared there and became a superstar. Now it's the Beatles' turn. The CBS 50 Theater is packed with 728 screaming teenagers. But the real audience is at home. 73 million Americans, 60% of the country's population, are tuned in. The Beatles play 5 songs. All My Loving, Till There Was You, She Loves You. I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. The screams are so loud the music is barely audible. Cameras capture the faces of girls crying, convulsing with emotion. It's mass hysteria broadcast live to an entire nation. The next day, the United States wakes up transformed. The Beatles are no longer a British phenomenon. They are a global phenomenon. 1964 was a whirlwind. The Beatles played 229 shows in 23 different countries. They recorded 2 full albums, A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale. They filmed their first movie, also titled A Hard Day's Night, a semi-comedy documentary that captured their natural charisma. The film was a critical and commercial success, proving that their talent transcended music. They have no days off. They sleep on planes and in hotels. They eat fast food and cold meals. Press conferences are daily, sometimes multiple a day. Journalists ask the same stupid questions over and over again. The Beatles respond with sarcastic humor that makes them even more endearing. "How did you find America?" a journalist asks. "We turned left in Greenland," Ringo replies. They are witty, approachable, but increasingly exhausted. Behind the glamour, the reality is brutal. They live in a hermetic bubble. They can't walk down the street without being attacked by hysterical fans who tear off their clothes, their hair, any part of them they can. The hotels must be fortresses. The windows remain closed and curtained. The freedom they had in Hamburg, in Liverpool, has completely vanished. John, always the most outspoken, begins to show frustration. In interviews, he says provocative things that Brian Epstein has to deal with. Paul maintains a perfect public facade, always diplomatic, always smiling. George becomes increasingly introverted, withdrawing from the chaos. Ringo, the quietest, simply tries to get through each day. The cracks aren't visible yet, but they're beginning to form. August 1965. The Beatles gave their most important performance on American soil, Shea Stadium in New York. It was the first rock concert in a sports stadium, something never before attempted. 55,600 people filled the baseball stadium. It was the largest audience in the history of live entertainment up to that time. The Beatles are playing on a platform at second base. The sound system is inadequate for such a large space. In fact, it's practically impossible to hear the music. The screams are so intense that they create a constant roar that drowns everything out. The Beatles can't hear each other. They play by muscle memory and observing each other's movements. It's organized chaos, a spectacle more visual than auditory. But it's a historic moment. Rock and roll has reached a scale no one imagined possible. London, March 1966. Maureen Cleave, a journalist for the Evening Standard, publishes an extensive interview with John Lennon. In it, John reflects on religion and fame. He says something he considers an obvious observation. Christianity is declining. It will disappear and evaporate. I don't need to argue about that. I'm right, and time will prove it. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will come first, rock and roll or Christianity. In the UK, the comment went almost unnoticed. The British understood the context and the tone. But when the interview was published in the US months later, coinciding with his August tour, the reaction was explosive. The deeply religious South of the US erupted in fury. Radio stations organized public burnings of Beatles records. Religious groups protested outside his concerts. John received death threats. The Ku Klux Klan announced protests. Brian Epstein organizes a press conference in Chicago, August 11, 1966. John must apologize, or the American tour could collapse. John, visibly uncomfortable, explains that he was misunderstood, that he didn't mean to offend. But the damage is done. The magic is broken. The Beatles are no longer four nice lads from Liverpool. They are controversial figures, targets of hatred and threats. On August 29th, they play their last commercial concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Only 25,000 of the 42,500 seats are occupied. At the end of the show, George Harrison feels a profound sense of relief. Good, he thinks, that's it. The four of them silently share this feeling. They have conquered the world, but they are fed up with the madness. Fed up with not being able to hear their own music. Fed up with living as prisoners of their fame. They board the plane back to London knowing that something fundamental has ended. They no longer want to be the Beatles on tour. They need to be something else, something more. The question is, what? London, April 1966. Abbey Road Studios becomes the Beatles' new home. Without tours to distract them, they can finally concentrate on what originally brought them together, making music. George Martin notices the change immediately. The lads who used to rush into the studio, recording albums in days, now arrive with complex ideas, ready to experiment for weeks. Freedom is intoxicating. Without the pressure of recreating songs live, they can build compositions impossible to perform on stage. They can use the studio as an instrument in itself. Martin, with his classical training and open mind, becomes an essential collaborator. If the Beatles can imagine it, Martin finds a way to make it a reality. June 1966. The album Revolver represents a quantum leap in their artistic evolution. Each song is an experiment. Eleanor Rigby uses an octet of strings without guitar, drums, or bass, something unheard of in rock. Tomorrow Never Knows is built on a single chord, with tape loops played in reverse, distorted guitar that sounds like seagulls, and drums processed to sound like distant thunder. John wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountain. Martin connects his microphone to a rotating Leslie speaker, normally used for organs. The result is hypnotic, psychedelic. Paul contributes For No One, featuring a French horn solo, Got to Get You Into My Life, with a Motown-inspired horn section. George, who has been exploring Indian music since discovering the sitar, writes Love You Too, a completely Indian composition featuring tabla, tambura, and sitar. Ringo, while not composing, provides inventive rhythms that anchor the wildest experiments. Revolver was released in August and divided audiences. Some fans missed the straightforward pop songs of the early years. But critics recognized something monumental. The Beatles had expanded the possibilities of what rock could be. Popular music was no longer just entertainment for teenagers. It could be art. November 1966. Paul has an idea during a flight. What if they stopped being the Beatles and became another band? A fictional band that would free them from expectations. It could be called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They could create a concept album where the songs flow seamlessly, like a continuous performance. John initially liked the idea, though his interest waned during production. George was skeptical but cooperated. Ringo, as always, agreed to the plan. George Martin saw the artistic potential. They gave it the green light. What followed were hundreds of hours of work at Abbey Road, experimenting without budget or time constraints. The Beatles spent 5 months recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, longer than their first 6 albums combined. They used every available technique, and some they invented: multiple overdubs, tapes played in reverse, altered speeds, full orchestras, exotic instruments, and experimental sound effects. A Day in the Life is the centerpiece. It begins with John's melancholic vocals over a simple piano accompaniment. It builds into orchestral chaos, where 40 classical musicians play from the lowest possible note to the highest, each at their own pace. The result is an apocalyptic crescendo. Then comes Paul's optimistic and worldly middle section, before returning to John's melancholy. The song ends with a piano chord played simultaneously on 4 different pianos, left to resonate for 42 seconds until it fades away in silence. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds creates psychedelic soundscapes. George's Within You Without You uses Indian classical musicians. When I'm 64 is a nostalgic tribute to British music hall. She's Leaving Home tells the story of a young woman who runs away from home, with heartbreaking string arrangements. The music is only part of the work. The cover had to be equally revolutionary. They hired Peter Blake and Jan Hayworth, British pop artists. The idea, a photograph where the Beatles, disguised as Sgt. Pepper's band, are surrounded by historical and cultural figures they admire. It's a collage of 20th century icons. In the photo studio, they create the scene with life-size cardboard cutouts. There are Oscar Wilde, Karl Marx, Marilyn Monroe, Bob Dylan, Edgar Allan Poe, Aleister Crowley, various Indian gurus, silent film stars, and literary heroes. The Beatles wear extravagantly Victorian military uniforms in bright colors. In the foreground, flowers spell out Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's. The cover becomes a work of art in itself, analyzed and discussed as much as the music. June 1st, 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is released simultaneously worldwide. It is the Beatles' first album with printed lyrics, allowing fans to analyze every word. Critics are unanimously astonished. The Times of London calls it a definitive work of art of our time. Contemporary musicians are simultaneously devastated and inspired. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had been working on his own experimental album Smile, hears Sgt. Pepper and temporarily abandons the project, feeling that the Beatles have gone beyond his reach. The album spent 15 weeks at #1 in the UK and 27 in the US. It sold 2.5 million copies in 3 months. But its impact transcended sales. Sgt. Pepper legitimized rock as a serious art form. Academics began to study rock lyrics. Musicians understood that albums could be cohesive artistic statements, not just collections of singles. The Summer of Love, the hippie movement, the psychedelic counterculture, all found their soundtrack in this album. August 25, 1967. Brian Epstein is spending the weekend at his country house in Sussex. He has been depressed lately. The Beatles no longer need a tour manager because they aren't touring. His contract with them is expiring soon, and he's unsure if it will be renewed. He has been grappling with his homosexuality in a society that criminalizes it. He takes sleeping pills regularly. On Sunday, his assistant finds him dead in his bed. Accidental overdose of carbital, a sedative. He is 32 years old. The Beatles were in Bangor, Wales, attending a meditation seminar with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi when they received the news. They were devastated. Brian was more than their manager. He was the invisible fifth Beatle, the man who believed in them when no one else did, who polished them without destroying their essence, who handled every aspect of their career with obsessive devotion. Paul later said, "We knew we were in trouble then. I thought we were the greatest in the world, but we didn't know what to do with it." Without Brian, they were adrift. September 1967. They need a new project to overcome their grief. Paul proposes something ambitious, a made-for-TV movie called Magical Mystery Tour, about a psychedelic bus trip through the English countryside. Paul will be the director. There will be no formal script, only improvisation and experimentation. It's a disaster. Without Brian to impose structure, without a professional director, without a coherent script, the project lacks direction. They filmed for 2 weeks in September, creating surreal scenes with no narrative connection. The editing is chaotic. The BBC broadcast the film on December 26 in black and white, even though it was filmed in color. The critics tear it apart. It's the Beatles' first public failure. The cracks widen. For the first time, they seem fallible. February 1968. Seeking escape and meaning, the Beatles travel to Rishikesh, India, to the ashram of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The complex is in the foothills of the Himalayas, beside the Ganges River. There they practice transcendental meditation, eat vegetarian food, and distance themselves from the chaos of the West. This is the most prolific songwriting period of their career. Without distractions, Without heavy drugs, without pressure, they write songs furiously. John composes Dear Prudence, Julia, and Sexy Sadie. Paul writes Back in the USSR, Blackbird, and Mother Nature's Son. George contributes While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Even Ringo writes his first complete song, Don't Pass Me By. They create enough material for a double album. But the harmony is illusory. Tensions grow regarding the Maharishi's sincerity. Rumors of inappropriate behavior toward female students circulate. John and George become disillusioned. In April, they abruptly leave the ashram. The spiritual escape is over. They return to London with dozens of new songs, but also with growing resentment and doubts about their future together. Paradise has revealed its cracks. May 1968. Abbey Road Studios welcomes the Beatles back from India. They bring 30 new songs to record. George Martin suggests selecting the best 14 or 15 for a concise, powerful album. The Beatles reject the idea. They want to release everything, a double album. Martin reluctantly agrees. The sessions for the Beatles, which would become known as the White Album for its minimalist, all-white cover, were tense from the start. For the first time, they frequently worked separately. Paul recorded his part, then John his, then George. They no longer built songs collaboratively. Each brought complete compositions and recorded them with minimal input from the others. The biggest source of tension has a name, Yoko Ono. John met her in November 1966 at an art gallery in London. Yoko is a Japanese conceptual artist, 7 years older than John, an intellectual, avant-garde, and completely unconnected to the world of rock. John is captivated. In May 1968, while his wife Cynthia is on vacation, John invites Yoko to his home. They spend the night recording avant-garde sound experiments. From that moment on, they are inseparable. John begins bringing Yoko to the recording sessions. This violates a sacred, unwritten rule. The studio is the Beatles' exclusive territory. Girlfriends and wives are not allowed. But John doesn't just bring Yoko. He sits her next to him, asks for her opinion, and includes her in musical decisions. Paul, George, and Ringo are uncomfortable but don't say anything directly. The tension silently builds. August 20th, 1968. Ringo leaves the band. He doesn't dramatize his departure with speeches or threats. He simply tells the others that he's leaving because he feels he isn't contributing, that his contributions aren't valued. He goes to Sardinia on actor Peter Sellers' yacht. For 2 weeks, he reflects on his future. The 3 remaining members continued recording. Paul played drums on Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence. When Ringo returned in early September, he found his drum kit covered in flowers. It was a gesture of peace, a silent apology. They recorded Good Night, Ringo's lullaby, with a lush orchestra. For now, they were together again. But the rift had been revealed. The Beatles were unbreakable. The tensions aren't just personal. They're also political. 1968 is a year of global revolution. Student protests in Paris, the Prague Spring, demonstrations against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement in the United States. John writes Revolution, a song that questions revolutionary violence. The lyrics say, "If you talk about destruction, you can count me out." Left-wing activists harshly criticize John. They accuse him of betraying the revolution, of being a hypocritical millionaire preaching peace from his mansion. John is hurt by the criticism. He records 2 versions of the song with slightly different lyrics, revealing his own ambivalence. Paul avoids taking a political stance. George is more interested in spirituality than politics. Ringo simply wants to play the drums. The ideological differences add another layer of division. November 22nd, 1968. The White Album is released. 30 songs ranging from hard rock, Helter Skelter, to acoustic ballads, Blackbird, from sonic experimentation, Revolution 9, to country, Rocky Raccoon, from blues, Your Blues, to music hall, Honey Pie. It is chaotic, inconsistent, brilliant, and frustrating all at once. Critics are divided. Some consider it a masterpiece of diversity. Others think it's self-indulgent, that it needed editing. George Martin maintains that it should have been a single album featuring the 14 best songs. Years later, Martin would create his own edited version to prove his point. But inconsistency is part of the story it tells. For individual artists working under the same name, no longer a cohesive unit. January 1969. Paul proposes a concept, a return to their roots. No studio tricks, no endless overdubs. Just the four of them playing together live, like in the old days at the Cavern Club. They'll record new songs while rehearsing and playing them live, all captured on camera for a documentary. The climax will be a live concert at an iconic venue. It will be called Get Back, a return to simplicity. The reality is miserable. They rehearse at Twickenham Film Studios, a huge, cold hangar. Cameras record everything, every argument, every awkward moment, every tense moment. George is particularly frustrated. He feels his songs are being ignored. Paul, assuming leadership in the void left by Brian Epstein, becomes domineering, almost bossy. John is distant, more interested in Yoko than in the band. January 10th, 1969. After an argument with Paul about how to play a song, George calmly says, "I'll see them in the clubs," picks up his guitar, and leaves. It's the second defection. For a week, the three remaining members debate: continue as a trio? Replace George? Disband? Finally, they negotiate George's return. They agree to leave Twickenham and move to Apple Corps' new studio, the basement of number 3 Savile Row. They also bring in Billy Preston, a talented American keyboardist they know from their time in Hamburg. The presence of an outsider helps. The Beatles tend to behave better when there are witnesses. Tensions temporarily ease. January 30th, 1969. The original plan was a massive concert in an amphitheater or stadium. But logistical complications and internal tensions made organizing something large impossible. They decided on something simpler and more unexpected. They would play on the rooftop of the Apple Corps building. At 12:30 in the afternoon, they climb onto the roof. It's cold, the wind is blowing. Ringo is wearing his wife Maureen's coat. John is wearing a brown jacket. George has a green jacket. Paul is wearing a dark suit. Billy Preston is at the keyboards. They begin to play. Below, in the streets of London, people stop, confused. Is that music coming from heaven? Office workers lean out of their windows. Traffic becomes congested as people leave their cars to get closer. They play 5 songs in full. Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, and Dig a Pony. Then they repeat, Get Back. The police arrive, complaining about the noise and demanding that the concert stop. On the recording, an officer can be heard speaking into his radio, "I can't stop them. They're the Beatles." When they finally stop, John says into the microphone, "I'd like to say thanks on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition." It's the Beatles' last public concert. 42 minutes on a cold rooftop, with makeshift equipment, before an audience of bewildered passers-by. A perfect ending for the band that never did anything conventional. The recordings for the Get Back project resulted in dozens of hours of footage. But no one wanted to deal with the editing. The sessions were so tense that reviewing the material was painful. The project was shelved, unfinished. Instead, they returned to Abbey Road with George Martin. Between February and August of 1969, they recorded what would be their final album as a collaborative band, Abbey Road. It was a farewell in disguise. The songs on side 2 form a continuous medley, short pieces masterfully linked by Martin. George's Here Comes the Sun is optimistic and refreshing. George's Something is a perfect ballad that even John admits is the best song on the album. John's Come Together is dark and funky. The end closes with a drum solo by Ringo, his only solo in the history of the Beatles, followed by interspersed solos from all 3 guitars. The last line Paul sings on the album is prophetic, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. It's a farewell, though no one officially knows it yet. Abbey Road is released on September 26, 1969. It's a massive success, praised by critics and fans alike. It's the #1 album of the year, and it's the Beatles' swan song. January 1969. Alan Klein enters the Beatles story. He's an aggressive and shrewd American businessman, known for renegotiating record contracts and securing royalties for artists. John, George, and Ringo admire him for his toughness. Klein promises to make them richer and protect their interests. He's charismatic and confident. He promises everything they want to hear. Paul doesn't trust him. He investigates Klein's past and finds troubling stories, dissatisfied former clients, lawsuits, shady deals. Paul prefers Lee Eastman, father of Linda Eastman, whom Paul married in March 1969. The Eastmans are respectable New York lawyers. But for John, this confirms his suspicions. Paul wants to control the gang through his in-laws. The battle for control of the band turns toxic. In May 1969, John, George, and Ringo vote for Klein as their new manager. Paul votes against it. It's 3-1. The Beatles' democracy, which had worked for years, now reveals its fatal flaw. What happens when there is fundamental disagreement? Paul feels betrayed. The other three feel Paul is arrogant, that he thinks he's superior. Apple Corps, the company created to manage their businesses jointly, becomes a legal battleground. Every decision requires unanimous approval. Every decision becomes a source of conflict. Music, once the heart of their union, is now secondary to the corporate chaos. March 1970. Klein hires Phil Spector, the legendary producer known for his Wall of Sound, to salvage the abandoned recordings of the Get Back project. Spector takes the tapes and, without consulting the Beatles, adds lush orchestration, female backing vocals, and dramatic effects. He transforms the Back to Roots project into something the opposite of the original vision. Paul was furious when he heard the final result, particularly his song, The Long and Winding Road, now drowned in strings and choir. It was his most personal song, a stark ballad about loss and loneliness. Spector had turned it into a sentimental, Hollywood-style production. Paul wrote angry letters demanding the production be reversed. He was ignored. The album was released as Let It Be on May 8, 1970. The irony is cruel. Let It Be, which means Let It Be or Let It Be, became the title of the last album officially released by the Beatles. But it wasn't actually the last album they recorded. Abbey Road, recorded afterward, had already been released months earlier. Let It Be is a ghost of the past, released after the band was already dead. April 10, 1970. Paul McCartney releases his first solo album, simply titled McCartney. It includes a question-and-answer document written by himself. One question reads, "Is your split with the Beatles temporary or permanent, due to personal or musical differences?" Paul's answer is straightforward. Personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but mostly because I want to be with my family more. Another question, do you miss the other Beatles and George Martin? Do you foresee a time when Lennon-McCartney will once again be an active songwriting partnership? Answer, no. The newspapers interpret it correctly. Paul announces that the Beatles have broken up. The news makes global headlines. Fans weep in the streets. Disc jockeys play Beatles marathons as if a death had occurred. John is furious, not because Paul is leaving the band. John wanted to leave first, but because Paul is announcing it publicly to promote his solo album. It wasn't me who broke up the Beatles, John says later. It was the Beatles who broke up the Beatles. But nobody wants to be the one who shoots Bambi. December 1970. Paul sues John, George, Ringo, and Apple Corps to legally dissolve the partnership. It's the only way to escape Alan Klein's control. His former bandmates see him as the villain, the one who selfishly destroyed the Beatles. The press portrays them as enemies. John gives interviews insulting Paul. Paul responds with veiled lyrics in his solo songs. The legal process is long and bitter. Lawyers review every contract, every agreement, every financial decision from the past decade. Friendships that survived fame, success, and pressure don't survive the legal battles. George, who suffered for years living in the shadow of Lennon-McCartney, finally has his moment as a solo artist. His triple album, All Things Must Pass, released in November 1970, is a massive success. It proves that the silent Beatle has a lot to say. Ringo also has solo hits, albeit more modest ones. John records experimental albums with Yoko, then more accessible albums like Imagine in 1971. The wounds are public. John writes, "How do you sleep?" A brutal attack on Paul. The lyrics are vicious. "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone you're just another day." He compares Paul to a beautiful but empty woman. The video for the album, Imagine, shows John parodying Paul. It's public cruelty between men who were once brothers. Paul responds subtly. Too Many People, on his album, Ram, contains lines that clearly refer to John and Yoko. But Paul is never as direct, as brutal, as John. His anger is more restrained. expressed in mournful melodies and lyrics that speak of loss and betrayal without naming anyone. George also has words for his former bandmates. Wah Wah is about the headache of infighting. Sue Me, Sue You Blues is about the endless legal battles. Ringo, the eternal peacemaker, avoids the attacks. His song, early 1970, sadly mentions the four members of the now disbanded group. December 8, 1980. New York City. John Lennon and Yoko Ono returned to the Dakota Building, their residence, after a recording session. A man waits at the entrance. Earlier that day, John signed an autograph for him. The man's name is Mark David Chapman. As John walks by, Chapman fires 4 shots into his back. John is rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. Doctors try to resuscitate him, but he has lost too much blood. At 11:07 p.m., they pronounce him dead. He is 40 years old. The world awakens to the unbelievable news. John Lennon has been murdered. Paul is at his farm in Scotland. Journalists are hounding him for a statement. Dazed and in shock, he awkwardly says, "It's a nuisance," words that sound cold but simply reflect his inability to process the magnitude of the loss. Later, he will explain that the shock made him respond without thinking. Days later, he will say publicly, "John will be remembered for his singular talent as a musician and for his generosity of spirit that touched millions of people." George immediately flies to New York to comfort Yoko. Ringo does too. The 3 surviving Beatles unite in mourning. Past fights seem absurd now. What do contracts, money, or who was to blame for the breakup matter? John is dead. There will never be reconciliation. There will never be a reunion. The dream of a possible future reconciliation dies with John on the sidewalk outside the Dakota. November 29, 2001. George Harrison dies of cancer in Los Angeles. He had battled the disease for years, first throat cancer, then lung cancer, and finally brain metastases. Unlike John, George had time to find peace. He spent his final years in relative tranquility, surrounded by family, occasionally working on music and practicing his Hindu spirituality. Paul and Ringo are with him near the end. There are no unresolved issues, no words left unsaid. George dies surrounded by love. He is 58 years old. Only 2 Beatles remain. Paul will say, "He was a lovely, brave guy and was always my baby brother." Ringo will simply say, "I already miss him." Decades later, the numbers only tell part of the story. The Beatles sold over 600 million records worldwide, more than any other artist in history. They have more #1 albums and more #1 singles than any other band. They are in every relevant Hall of Fame. They influenced every rock artist who came after them. But numbers are abstract. True legacy lives on in concrete moments. A 13-year-old girl in 1964 listening to "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and feeling for the first time that popular music can speak directly to her. A young musician in 1967 listening to Sgt. Pepper and understanding that rock can be art. A couple separated by the ocean in 1965, each listening to Yesterday and thinking of the other. Paul and Ringo are still alive, still making music. Paul continues to tour, playing 3-hour shows for audiences of all ages. Ringo leads his all-star band, surrounded by talented musicians. Occasionally they play together, 2 survivors of a story that seems impossible but happened. At Abbey Road, the pedestrian crossing from the album cover is now a pilgrimage site. Fans from all over the world cross the street, recreating the iconic photo. The walls outside the studio are covered with messages, graffiti, and declarations of love for a band that ceased to exist more than 50 years ago, but whose music refuses to die. Liverpool, the 1950s. Before the Beatles, British popular music was mostly imitation. British artists copied American sounds with fake accents, pretending to be something they weren't. Rock and roll was American. Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, the innovators all came from America. The British were consumers, not creators. The Beatles changed all that. They took American influences, rock and roll, rhythm and blues, Motown, and transformed them into something new, authentically British. They sang with their own Liverpool accents. They wrote their own songs instead of relying on professional songwriters. Before the Beatles, hardly any rock band wrote their own material. After the Beatles, it was unthinkable not to. The music industry before the Beatles was stratified. There were professional songwriters in offices in New York and London who wrote songs. There were producers who decided what was recorded and how. There were artists who simply performed material that others created for them. The process was industrial, corporate, and controlled. The Beatles demonstrated that artists could control the entire creative process. They wrote, performed, and produced. Eventually, with George Martin, they became involved in every production decision. They chose the final takes, determined the arrangements, and decided the order of the songs on the albums. This creative autonomy was revolutionary. After them, serious artists demanded creative control. The idea of the auteur in music, the artist as a complete vision, not just a performer, was born with the Beatles. Until the mid-60s, rock albums were collections of singles and filler. The important format was the single, a radio hit. Albums existed primarily to capitalize on that success by selling 8 additional mediocre tracks alongside the 2 hits. Sgt. Pepper changed this forever. It proved that an album could be a cohesive artistic statement, where each song contributes to a larger whole. After Sgt. Pepper, artists began to think of albums as complete works. Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, all the great album artists of the following decades owe this to the Beatles. The concept album format that would dominate progressive rock in the 1970s was born directly from what the Beatles first did. Abbey Road Studios before the Beatles was a conservative place. The engineers wore white coats. The rules were strict. This is how drums are recorded. This is how vocals are recorded. Don't deviate from established methods. George Martin initially worked within these constraints. The Beatles, especially during the Revolver and Sgt. Pepper sessions, demolished the rules. Did they want vocals to sound like they were coming from the moon? They experimented with effects. Did they want drums that sounded like thunder? They processed the sound. Did they want guitars that sounded like seagulls? They used unconventional tape techniques. They connected microphones to Leslie speakers. They played tapes backward. They varied the recording speed. They built loops manually. Norman Smith, lead engineer for much of the Beatles' recording, recalled, "Every session was it can't be done. And we ended up doing it." This mindset transformed music production. After the Beatles, the recording studio ceased to be merely a place to capture live performance. It became a laboratory, an instrument in itself. All subsequent experimental rock, from Pink Floyd to Radiohead, descends from this approach. Before the 1960s, youth was seen as a temporary state. Teenagers consumed children's culture until they became adults who consumed adult culture. There wasn't really a permanent youth culture with its own aesthetics, values, and economy. The Beatles were instrumental in changing this. Beatlemania demonstrated that young people were not just a market, but a dominant cultural and economic force. Companies began designing products specifically for youth. Clothing, movies, television, advertising, everything began to cater to young tastes. The generation gap became a defining characteristic of Western culture. The Beatles didn't cause this alone. Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the hippie counterculture, they all contributed. But the Beatles were the massive entry point. They were safe enough that parents didn't completely hate them, but rebellious enough that young people felt a connection to them. Liverpool is a port city, but it's not London or Manchester. It's not a cultural center. Before the Beatles, the idea that the next biggest band in the world would come from Liverpool was absurd. London had the BBC, the record labels, the theaters. Liverpool had docks and factories. The Beatles' success proved that talent could come from anywhere. They broke the geographical centralization of culture. After them, bands from Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, industrial cities in the north of England, began to find success. The British invasion of the United States in the 1960s included bands from all over Great Britain, not just London. This principle spread globally. If 4 lads from Liverpool could conquer the world, why not 4 lads from Seattle? From Melbourne? From Stockholm? The Beatles inadvertently democratized the geography of popular music. The next great band could come from anywhere, a principle that still defines the music industry. Popular music before the Beatles was rarely taken seriously as a literary form. The lyrics were simple rhyme schemes about teenage love. No one analyzed rock lyrics the way they analyzed serious poetry. Intellectuals looked down on popular music as empty entertainment. Later Beatles lyrics, especially John's, influenced by Bob Dylan, changed this perception. A Day in the Life, references current events and modern existence. Eleanor Rigby tells a story of urban loneliness with vivid imagery. I Am the Walrus plays with language and absurdism. Across the Universe explores spiritual ideas with poetic language. Academics began studying rock lyrics. Universities offered courses on the Beatles. The line between popular entertainment and serious art blurred. This intellectual legitimization of popular music has complex effects, some positive, others perhaps overly pretentious, but it undeniably changes how society perceives popular music. The Beatles' breakup established a pattern that would be repeated endlessly, the successful band breaking up at its peak. Before them, bands simply carried on until nobody wanted them anymore. Frank Sinatra parted ways with Tommy Dorsey, but that was different, a vocalist leaving a jazz band. The Beatles proved that a band at the height of their success could break up for artistic and personal reasons. They created the model of early success, artistic maturation, internal tensions, dramatic split, solo careers, public nostalgia, and endless reunion speculation. This pattern repeats itself time and again. The Smiths, Oasis, One Direction, and countless other bands. The Beatles' narrative arc became the archetypal narrative arc of the rock band. The question that never goes away: would they have eventually reunited? Before John's death, there were signs of reconciliation. Relations between John and Paul were beginning to heal. They called each other occasionally. They talked about possible future collaborations. Nothing definite, but the door was open. John's death closed those doors permanently. Paul, George, and Ringo played together occasionally afterward. In 1994 and 1995, they worked on the Anthology project, using demos John had recorded before his death to create new Beatles songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. Paul used technology to complete the recordings, adding new guitar, bass, and drum parts. The result was emotional but also strange, ghosts collaborating with the living. But a real reunion, the four of them together, never happened. It can never happen, and perhaps that's fitting. The Beatles exist, perfectly preserved in time. They didn't age on stage like the Rolling Stones. They didn't do mediocre reunion tours for the money. They finished before becoming irrelevant. Their legacy remains pure, frozen in the exact moment before the magic completely dissipated. London, 2025. Apple Corps, the company founded by the Beatles in 1968, is still in operation. Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and the families of John and George control the legacy. Every decision regarding the use of Beatles music, images, or names requires approval. They are fiercely protective, rejecting most commercial applications to prevent the brand from being diluted. But they are also creative curators. They oversee remastered reissues of the albums. They carefully approve documentaries. In 2021, Peter Jackson's documentary, Get Back, used restored footage from the January 1969 sessions. The result reveals nuances that earlier versions obscured. Yes, there was tension, but there was also joy, creativity, moments of genuine connection. The simplistic narrative of they hated each other in the end turns out to be more complex. They were human beings with complicated relationships, not caricatures. The most remarkable phenomenon: each generation rediscovers the Beatles. The original fans of the 60s are now grandparents. Their children grew up in the 70s and 80s listening to their parents' records. Their grandchildren in the 2000s are discovering the Beatles on digital platforms. And now, in the 21st century, the great-grandchildren of those original fans are listening to Here Comes the Sun on TikTok. This isn't a case of forced nostalgia. Every generation finds something resonant. Teenagers in 2025, navigating complicated relationships in the digital age, still feel something real when Paul sings, I'll Follow the Sun. The melody, the emotion, the authenticity, they transcend decades. This is rare. Most popular music has a shelf life of years, maybe a decade. The Beatles have maintained cultural relevance for more than 60 years. Musicologists, historians, and critics have spent decades trying to explain exactly what made the Beatles special. Were they the most technically gifted musicians? No. There are guitarists more virtuosic than George, bassists more complex than Paul, and drummers more technically skilled than Ringo. Was John the best lyricist? Debatable. Bob Dylan wrote with greater poetic depth. Leonard Cohen had more literary sophistication. The answer lies in the unique chemistry between four specific individuals. John, Paul, and George's vocal harmonies sounded a certain way because their voices complemented each other perfectly. The creative tension between Paul's melodic romanticism and John's cynical edge produced songs that balanced sweetness and harshness. Paul's perfectionism propelled the band forward. John's irreverence kept them from becoming too polished. George's spirituality added depth. Ringo's good humor kept everything grounded. Separately, each was talented. Together, for an extraordinary decade, they were alchemy. The sheer volume of Beatles material continues to astound. 13 studio albums in 7 years. Dozens of singles. Multiple BBC recordings. Hamburg material. Demos, alternate takes, different mixes. The anthology project in the 1990s unearthed hours of previously unreleased recordings. Every time new technology emerges, everything is remastered again. Stereo, CD, digital remastering, Dolby Atmos. Each format receives a complete overhaul. In 2023, using artificial intelligence, Paul extracted John's vocals from a low-quality demo recorded in 1977. He cleaned it up and isolated it. With Ringo, he recorded a new final Beatles song, Now and Then. It was both emotional and controversial. Was this a technological resurrection or a desecration? Opinions were divided. But the fact that they could still create cultural moments 60 years after their formation is a testament to their enduring power. Liverpool today is unrecognizable compared to the bombed-out city where the Beatles grew up. The original Cavern Club closed in 1973, demolished to make way for an underground tunnel. But it was rebuilt in 1984 on the same site, using original bricks. It is now a museum and concert venue, attracting thousands of tourists annually. Liverpool Airport is officially called Liverpool John Lennon Airport. Its motto is "Above Us, Only Sky," a line from the song Imagine. Penny Lane and Strawberry Field, locations immortalized in songs, are tourist attractions. Mendips, the house where John grew up with his Aunt Mimi, and Fourth Lynn Road, where Paul lived, are preserved by the National Trust. Fans can tour them and see the rooms where songs that changed the world were written. The Beatles Story Museum at Albert Dock receives millions of visitors. The city has built an entire tourism industry around four lads who made their hometown famous. It's commercial exploitation, yes, but it's also genuine pride. Liverpool suffered severe economic decline in the 70s and 80s. The Beatles are a reminder that something great emerged from those tough streets. Abbey Road Studios is still in operation. Artists still want to record there specifically because the Beatles recorded there. The pedestrian crossing is probably the most photographed in the world. The studio offers tours where fans can see Studio 2, where most of the Beatles' catalog was recorded. They can see the stairs where the inner sleeve photo of the album, A Hard Day's Night, was taken. They can stand where Paul stood when he recorded Yesterday. Musically, the influence is ubiquitous. Oasis essentially built their career by being openly derivative of the Beatles. 90s Britpop in general was a 60s revival filtered through 3 decades. Arctic Monkeys, while having their own distinctive sound, constantly cite Beatles' influence. Taylor Swift has mentioned studying McCartney's song structures. Kanye West has sampled Nowhere Man. Hip-hop, country, metal, genres that superficially have nothing to do with the Beatles, all have artists who cite the influence of the Fab Four. Paul McCartney is 83 years old in 2025. He still tours regularly. His shows last almost 3 hours. He plays bass guitar, piano, acoustic guitar, and electric guitar. He sings songs from all eras of the Beatles, Wings, and his solo career. His voice, though aged, retains enough of its signature tone. He fills stadiums. Audiences include original fans from the 60s along with teenagers discovering the songs for the first time. Ringo Starr is 85 years old. He also continues to tour with his all-star band. His shows are more relaxed, less marathons, and more celebrations. Ringo plays Beatles hits, his own solo hits, and gives the other musicians room to shine. He maintains his cheerful personality and his obvious love for playing the drums. Occasionally, when their tours coincide geographically, Paul and Ringo reunite on stage. They play a few Beatles songs together. These moments generate global news. Videos circulate online. Fans weep. It's not a Beatles reunion. It never can be, but it's a reminder that the magic, though different, hasn't completely died. What would they have done if they had stayed together? It's a favorite speculation among fans. In reality, they probably would have produced some good albums and many mediocre ones. Bands that stay together for decades usually dilute their legacy. The Rolling Stones are a competent touring machine, but no one argues that their albums of the last 30 years equal their work from the 60s and 70s. The breakup, though painful, preserved the legend. The Beatles exist in the collective memory as young, creative, and revolutionary. There are no images of them playing in casinos to pay off mortgages. No failed comeback albums. No sad nostalgia tours. Just 13 albums, some extraordinary, some good, none truly bad. A perfectly condensed career. Abbey Road, November 25, 2025. A Beatles remix session is underway. Engineers are working with technology that would have seemed like magic to George Martin. They can isolate each individual instrument from 60-year-old multi-track recordings. They can clean up imperfections or intentionally leave them in because they add character. They can create spatial mixes where each instrument occupies its own three-dimensional space. But even with all this technology, the essence remains intact. When they play A Day in the Life, when that final piano chord rings out and echoes for 42 seconds before fading into silence, it still works. It still evokes awe. It still sounds like nothing else that has been recorded before or since. That is the true legacy of the Beatles. Not record sales, not awards, not records. It's that four lads from Liverpool, in less than a decade of active collaboration, created music that refuses to age. Generation after generation discovers those songs and feels something real. Beatlemania as a cultural phenomenon ended in 1970. But the music, that unrepeatable achievement, lives on. In damp basements in cities around the world, teenagers still form bands. They learn Beatles chords. They dream of writing something that will move people in the same way. Most won't succeed, but the fact that they try, that the aspiration still exists, is the truest tribute. The Beatles didn't just make music. They showed what music could be. They expanded the territory of possibility. And 70 years after they first played together in Liverpool, that expanded territory remains the landscape where all popular music is created. The last chord still echoes, and as long as there are people listening, it will never stop playing.